behalf of the People's Forum, George Caldwell, welcome to the Unifor Local 27.
Thank you very much, Jim, and our heartfelt thanks to the Unifor Local 27 for hosting this event, and our enormous gratitude to the whole history of the union movement, which has done so much to make it possible for us to enjoy social justice here in Canada. And now that our advantages are under threat, we need the unions even more than ever, and all of us need to be working with and supporting them in that struggle. It's the organization that set up this meeting in cooperation with our speaker is known as Citizens Inquest, a local organization that has that calls into question issues neglected or views distorted by the mainline media, such as the official story of 9/11, or as our little understanding of our money system, which will be dealt with much more thoroughly tonight. Now our speaker, whose name you know, was elected to Parliament in 1949 at the age of 25. He ran for leadership of the Liberal Party in 1968 against Pierre Trudeau, and then later served as acting Prime Minister and Minister of Defense under Trudeau. In the 1990s, he started the Canadian Action Party, which was committed to bringing together the political parties, progressive political parties, and participants in political action in the hope that we could unite the left against the conservatives who have since then managed to unite themselves, much to our disadvantage. This evening, he will be explaining to us some of the issues he deals with in his remarkable new book, The Money Mafia, and the present crisis that we're facing. And in this book, he brings together not only his 91 years of wisdom, but also his passionate concern for human and environmental welfare, which is a lifelong commitment on his part. So please welcome the Honorable Paul Hellyer.
Thank you very much, George, for that. Reminds me of something General Eisenhower said, when you hear something like that, it's like chewing gum. It's okay to taste it for a few minutes, but for heaven's sake, don't swallow it. And where'd Jim go? Pardon me?
Behind you.
Anyway, you're back there. I have a question for you. The last time I spoke in the Canadian Auto Workers Hall, I was made an honorary Canadian Auto Worker. Now what I want to know is whether I have grandfather rights, and I'm going to be an honorary member of Unifor.
As you know, Paul, we can never do anything without blessing about our membership, but if you were once a Canadian honorary member of the CAW, you are definitely an honorary member of Unifor.
Thank you very much. So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for coming. Tonight I want to speak, I'm speaking about my new book, The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis. And the subtitle is equally important as the title. And what the book is a bridge between the world we think we live in and the real world we live in. because there are so many important issues which are kept from us by the mainline media that we really don't know what is going on around us. And they go to great lengths to try and keep us from getting the truth. Well, you'll find in the Money Mafia a lot of truth, and I think you'll find quite a bit of it that perhaps you haven't been exposed to before. And so I hope, naturally, that you'll be curious, and some of you have already bought books, and others I hope will later on. But the most important aspect, and the issue that I'd like to concentrate on tonight, is why I believe it is essential to persuade members of Parliament of all parties that to ratify the Canadian-European Trade Agreement, CETA, when it contains financial provisions, would be an act of high treason. Not only would it be treason, it would be illegal. Because CETA would be an automatic change in our Constitution, in that at the moment, the Parliament of Canada has 100% exclusive rights over money and banking. CETA would change that by giving European banks considerable control over our system. To change the Constitution that way requires 2/3 majority of the Canadian provinces for the majority of the people. So what is being proposed is illegal and immoral. And that's the reason that, in my opinion, we have to go all out to salvage our birthright before it's too late. Well, the subtitle of the book is A World in Crisis. You don't have to talk to most people very long to get agreement that things are in one H of a mess. Fewer, perhaps, only 1 or 2% understand why this has happened. It was not an accident. It has been due to a long, deliberate plan on the part of a few of the most powerful people, the most ruthless people, and the most least caring people in the world, to increase their power and wealth at the expense of the majority. As early as 1941, long before World War II was over, a powerful organization in the United States called the Council on Foreign Relations assumed that Germany would lose the war, so they began to plan, even then, in the middle of the war, a new and bigger empire after the war, centered in the United States, but including the land that Germany was after, as well as United States, Canada, Australia, and some Far Eastern countries. It was really a grand plan, and they've been working on it ever since. It is far advanced, too far, in my opinion, for comfort. Along the way, they got some allies. One of them is the Bilderbergers. The Bilderbergers got their name from the Hotel de Bilderberg in Holland. They started out as a fairly legitimate organization interested in the issues at the end of the war, uniting Europe so that there would never be another war like the last two, hopefully. But then they changed and they became really the most secretive organization probably in the world, or one of the most secret. And it was headed by powerful members of the banking cartel. They're the principal driving force. And they've been calling the shots for decades. And then a few years later, Mr. Brzezinski decided that because Japan was coming up in power, that they shouldn't be excluded, and they should be part of the organization, including Europe and North America. So they set up a third organization called the Trilateral Commission. Now I have a brief chapter in my book on these three organizations and what they've been up to, and I call them the Three Sisters. They picked the candidates for President of the United States for both parties, so they can't lose. It doesn't really make very much difference to them whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, because they have been chosen and financed by this group, which I now subsequently call the cabal. So I sort of slip back and forth between these different words for what's going on, but the cabal is a good one and covers them all. They pick people likely to do their bidding, who can read the scripts without too much improvisation. For example, Bill Clinton was taken by David Rockefeller to the Bilderberg meeting, and they explained to him how they would like to have an organization called NAFTA to unify Canada, the United States, and Mexico, primarily for the purpose of getting Mexican cheap labor for Canadian and US manufacturers. So they could charge almost as much for the product, but have much lower costs, and consequently bigger profits. So apparently Mr. Clinton agreed and went back to the United States. And then the power of the cabal, which is so great that they really control the major news outlets, the TV organizations, the radio organizations, and the major newspapers. They went behind Clinton, of course, and despite his checkered career, he was successful in getting the Democratic nomination. And he was also successful in his payback. First, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and it shouldn't have been called a free trade agreement because there is no such thing as free trade with the United States. It's really an investment agreement. An investment agreement designed to increase the size of the pond that the big fish could fish in. Canada, the US Free Trade Agreement, and then NAFTA were the first round in taking power away from the people and handing it over to the multinational corporations, which themselves are under the control of the banking cartel. Somebody did a study recently, and it showed that nearly all of the major transnational corporations have direct ties to the banking institutions. So that was round one, and now round two, or CETA, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're designed to finish the job that the Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA began. So all of those areas that we haven't yet lost our power on are going to be transferred now outside our jurisdiction to the transnational corporations, and they have this clause in them, dispute settlement clause, which allows disputes between transnational corporations and the host country to be settled by outside tribunals under the control of the transnationals, the cartel, cabal, whatever, and not from the Canadian courts or American courts. So we have no power to legislate that we don't want somebody or something in Canada. And there was an announcement in one of the papers this last week. It was Apotex, I think it was, suing the Canadian government because we refused to approve a product that we weren't satisfied was safe. And that's exactly what this transformation is all about. So that the cartel, the transnational corporations, control everything, and the people who go through the charade of electing parliamentarians have no power, because the power has all been given away. Well, this is to be their coup d'etat. This is, if it happens, as far as I'm concerned, it's game over. So that's how big the stakes are. And that's the reason that I feel so passionately about it, and hope that we can get people right across the country feeling passionate. Because only a coalition of concerned people like ourselves, and the trade union movement, the churches, the students, and the Aboriginal First Nations could stop this. Working together, I really believe that we can. Because this, if it were to go through, means that just about everything that we always thought we had some control over has been transferred to unaccountable, unelected, unaccountable people who answer to the power elite. When I say the power elite, this is less than 1/10 of 1% of the 1%. So you know how small it is. Well, the power elite comprises not only the Three Sisters and the international banking cartel, but also the oil cartel, transnational corporations, certain parts of the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, bless them, looking into our lives day in and day out. Nobody escapes. They've got you on the list, and heaven help you after the New World Order is introduced if you've been on the wrong side, which most of us here would have been. So, and critically important, parts of the US military. I call them, as I told you, the cabal, but also they're called the shadow government in the United States. And they have been running the United States since General Eisenhower, and running much of the Western world at the same time. Plus, this shadow government is all conclusive. Its power is recognized by insiders. When Sarah McClendon, a veteran reporter in the White House press gallery, asked President Clinton why he didn't come clean on the extraterrestrial presence and technology, he said, "Sarah," and I quote, "there is a government within the government, and I don't control it." Imagine the President of the United States, presumably the most powerful person in the world, the one with the finger on the atomic button, doesn't even know what his own subordinates are doing. And that's been true since Eisenhower. Well, the cabal, this all-inclusive organization, is planning a new world order comprising a dictatorship controlled by them. And they have, unless it is stopped somehow, the power to bring it about in accordance with their plan that's been in the works for about 50 or 60 years. The apex of their power is the money mafia, which has been robbing ordinary folks for centuries. The money mafia, or cartel, has a monopoly on money creation. Consequently, as money is the gasoline that drives any economy, they control economies all over the world. So they decide the level of unemployment, the level of economic growth, or how much austerity is necessary to shrink the economy to meet the requirement that they have for debt levels and people being able to pay the interest on them. And there's only one way to do something about this. There is no hope of robust growth of the kind that we knew a few years ago. No hope. Unless we inject a very significant amount of government-created debt-free money into the economy, both of our country and of other economies around the world. There's just no other solution, mathematically. Well, to understand what I'm talking about, maybe a little history would help. Going back a bit in history, we used to use mostly coins to settle our accounts. We had gold and silver and copper and iron coins, but they got too cumbersome and too heavy to carry around for the level of commerce. So then, I guess maybe about 1,000 years ago, the Chinese began to introduce paper money. And certainly that was much more prevalent years ago than it is now. Today, however, nearly all money is bank deposit money, which isn't real money, it's virtual money. It is just, in fact, computer entries. That's all it is. The first governor of the Bank of Canada, Graham Towers, and probably the brightest that we've ever had, said money is only a book entry, that's all it is. But if he were alive today, he would say money is only a computer entry. That's all it is. But I would just like to go back about 3 centuries to the just before the Bank of England was chartered, and remind you that Charles I did something that no king should do. He confiscated the money that was on deposit in the Tower of London. Just confiscated is a nice word for saying he stole it. It sounds better, doesn't it? You know. Well, then, what happened was that the people who had been putting their money there began looking for a place to put it where it would be safe. So they decided on the goldsmiths of Lombard Street in London. And the reason they chose it is because the goldsmiths already had strong boxes that were fireproof and where they kept their own valuables. So they deposited their gold with the goldsmiths, and the goldsmiths gave them receipts for the gold. And then what happened, of course, was that people found it was easier to trade receipts than to go and get a bag of gold. You wanted a fur coat for your wife, You don't want to go into the goldsmiths and get a whole bag of gold, so you just take receipts for the necessary amount and give that to the shopkeeper. So that was sort of the beginning of banknotes. And it was a scam. It was illegal. But it was made to look legal very soon after that. It was legitimized by the king, William of Orange. When he ran out of money and he had no credit, what did he do? He got the moneylenders, and then he talked to them, made a tentative deal, and he went to Parliament and got a bill passed to establish the Bank of England with fantastic powers. And the rich people subscribed £1,200,000 in gold and silver. They lent it all to the king at 8%, which is a pretty high rate for a government guaranteed loan. And then to show his appreciation, the king said, now you may print, P-R-I-N-T, £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend them to your friends at high interest rates. So in effect, the moneyed class was able to lend the same money twice, once to the king and once to their friends, and collect interest from both. And we call that leverage. And that was the beginning of what the economists have called the partial reserve system. At that time, a reserve of 50%. Well, since then, the bankers, who are very greedy people, some of them, and with the collusion of politicians, have sweetened the pie. In the early years of the 20th century in the United States, federally incorporated banks had to have a gold reserve of 25%. So in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. When I was a young man, the reserve in cash in Canada was 8%. So our banks were allowed to lend the same money 12.5 times. Well, then with the change in system and the introduction of monetarism and the ideas of Milton Friedman, and in effect the deregulation of the banking system, that ratio went up to 20-to-1. So the banking system now can legally lend the same money 20 times to 20 different people and collect interest from every single one of them. Well, that's the reason I've called them the money mafia. You've been reading the papers about the investigation in Montreal of what's been going on there in the construction industry. The mafia have been taking 2 to 2.5% off the top. Well, the money mafia takes 95% off the top. They can invest $5 million in what I call blood, sweat, and tears money. That's just another way of saying that money that you work for, that you got wages for building cars or farming or cutting hair or whatever it is that you do. $5 million of that kind of money that someone has to work for, and then they can make loans of $100 million. Create $100 million of virtual computer entry money on the basis of a reserve, not even a reserve of capital, $5 million. So it's 95% of what they can collect back is profit, right off the top. Well, it's unfair. Take students, for example, who have to, in order to graduate, borrow maybe $50,000 from the bank. The bank only has to have $2,500 in it of capital in order to loan the student $50,000. So the bank has $2,500 in blood, sweat, tears money, and then the student, after he or she graduates, has to work for years to pay not $2,500 back, but $50,000. Wow, plus interest. So it could be 60, 70, 100,000. Well, a lot of people don't know how the banking system works. But this is a little example. If you go into the bank and want to borrow $35,000 to buy a car, they'll ask you for some collateral and some stocks or bonds. If you don't have that, maybe a mortgage on your house, second mortgage on your cottage. And if you don't have any of those things, maybe a co-signature from a rich relative of some kind. And when you've got the collateral, they'll say, sign this note for $35,000 at an interest rate of, say, prime plus, whatever, 2 or 2.5, depending on the color of your eyes. And as soon as you sign that, they type the computer, $35,000 shows up in your account that you can go out and buy the car with. Seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air. And the biggest myth in banking, and I have more trouble getting this through to a lot of people, including some bank managers, they think that the money the bank lends you today was what somebody else deposited yesterday. Not true. They're almost always fully lent out. So if you go in and borrow money, provided they have a little bit of capital, they can create the money for you out of thin air, and you have to pay it all back, plus interest. And that's the way the system works. Now the banks have their method of accounting is a sort of a double entry, where your note becomes an asset on the bank's books, and the money they create is a liability. And the way they make their money is because they may charge you prime plus 2, say, could be 7% or 5%, depending on how high interest rates are at the time. But if you decided not to spend the $35,000 right away because you just read in the paper where next year the cars are going to have improvements that you wanted to wait for, and you left it on deposit for 6 months, it'd either pay you no interest on it, or maybe 1/8 of 1%. So the difference between the 5 or 6 that they charge you on your note and the 0 or 1/8 of 1% that they pay you on your deposit is what the economists call the spread. And that's how they make their money. So the more money they create, the more loans they have out, the more the spread, the more they make, and the higher their profits are. Well, you know, the present system is insane. I say it's more insane than insane, if that's possible. Because you don't need a PhD in economics to know what any grade 12 mathematics graduate could understand. And that is that if all money is created as debt, and it's all debt that has to be repaid, and it's all debt that has to be repaid with interest, and nobody creates any money with which to pay the interest, what do you have to do? You have to borrow more to pay the interest and go deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. So that's how the United States got $16 trillion in debt. That's how a lot of people are up to here in debt, because that is the system that we have inherited from 300 years of being irresponsible at the political. This is a system, of course, that creates booms and busts, because they can create a lot of credit for a while, and the balloon keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and everybody's feeling good because everything's moving forward. And all of a sudden, the debt load gets too high, and it's just like putting a pin in the balloon, and it goes, psh. And then you have a recession or a depression. Thousands of people lose their homes and their farms, their jobs, sometimes millions. And we've all seen that happen, and it doesn't need to be. Remember this, we the people still own the right to create money, the patent. The patent is ours. The Bank of Canada is owned by us. The shares are held by the Minister of Finance in Ottawa for us. We own it. The banks have no rights, only privileges. They're licensees, and they can be limited in any way that Parliament or Congress desires. All they have to do is pass appropriate legislation. Well, we need some different rules. For many years in Canada, we had a workable system. And I remember it well because I'm a child of the Depression, and I was around in the years that I'm talking about. In 1938, there were no jobs in Canada, none. In 1939, along came the war, and it wasn't long before everyone was either in the armed forces or working, and unemployment was reduced to an historic low of 1%. And you might say, well, where did the government get all the money to pay the people in the armed forces and to pay for the ammunition and to pay to build those factories and all that sort of thing? Well, a lot of it the Bank of Canada printed, P-R-I-N-T-E-D. It was very simple. The government of Canada just handed them a bond. The Bank of Canada literally printed the money, gave it to the government, deposited it in their accounts, and then the government spent it for wages, for ammunition, and so on. And it became what the economists called high-powered money. It went into the banks and was used as the base for them to expand their credit and help finance building new factories and so on. This is the system that we had from 1939 to 1974. And it got us out of the Depression really fast. It helped finance the war. It helped finance the post-war development. St. Lawrence Seaway, Trans-Canada Highway, great new air terminals, and helped us lay the base for one of the best social security systems in the world. Well, then in 1974, the game changed. The Bank of Canada stopped working for its shareholders and started taking its orders from the Bank for International Settlements in Zurich, Switzerland. And they made a couple of decisions that were not in our interest. One was to fight inflation by means of high interest rates, which resulted in those horrendous debts that we built up in 81, 82, and then again in 90, 91. And to stop giving low-cost money to governments. Well, what has happened since is that when those two recessions that I just mentioned happened, of course, hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs, businesses went bankrupt, people had less money to pay taxes on, and we got in deficits. And this was rolled over into debt. And would you guess how much interest we've paid on the debt since that happened? From 1974-75 fiscal year until 2010-11, $1 billion. It's such a big sum you can hardly get your mouth around it, obviously. I couldn't. Can you imagine how far that would go towards building urban transportation, or speeding up the health system, or replacing old broken down water mains and bridges that need replacing, and old hospitals that need refurbishing or replacing, and doing all of the things that need to be done? Incredible. Yet it's all happened because we didn't understand what was going on, what was being done to us by the banking mafia and the cartel that has taken over the governance of the world. And we've got to change it, or we're never going to have the kind of country for our young people that we had, and the advantages that we had. So I have some other things here that we could have done. You know, there was a piece in the paper the other day about 25 years ago. Ed Broadbent introduced a motion in Parliament to reduce child poverty and to end it in 25 years. And it's worse now than it was then. Why? Well, just because what we've been discussing. The system has changed, and we've got ourselves so far in debt that governments have been contracting and following austerity, and instead of expanding and putting our young people to work, they have been pulling the rug right out from under us. Well, it should be obvious what we have to do. We have to do something similar to 1939-74 and share the money creation function. That's what happened in those years, that the money creation function was shared between the Government of Canada directly, borrowing directly from the Bank of Canada and the private banks. And it worked, gave us the best years of the 20th century. So a few years ago, 2 or 3, a number of colleagues and I recommended a new social contract between the government and people of Canada. And the banks would return to the cash reserve system, which was abandoned in Canada in 1991. Mr. Mulroney was in power, and I don't think he probably knew what was going on either. But before that, we had cash reserves, 8%. After that, the cash reserves were limited. Our banks don't have to have any cash whatsoever, and most of them have about a 1 or 1.5%. So of the dollar you think you have in the bank, there's only 1 cent or 1.5 cents in legal tender, real money. So that's the reason you have to worry about runs. Well, you don't have to because they're insured, but up to a certain level. But that's the system. It's a Ponzi scheme of, you know, fantastic proportions. That's what it is. So what we recommended was that the banks be returned to a cash reserve system, and that the cash reserves be increased by 5% a year for 7 years until the banks had 34% reserves. And the government would give the Bank of Canada, instead of bonds, 15 nominal shares in Canada of $10 billion each, non-transferable, non-convertible, non-redeemable against the collateral. The Bank of Canada would create $150 billion a year for those 7 years, lesser amounts later, but that's to get it up to the 34% level. On the understanding that the $150 billion would be split 50-50 between the federal government and the provinces. And with the understanding that the provinces would look after the municipalities, get the gardener taken down in Toronto and provide some decent transportation, so if you visit us there, that you wouldn't have to spend 3/4 of the day getting where you're going and coming back. And Ontario's, if I remember correctly, I think Ontario's share would be $38 billion. That's more than enough to balance the budget in Ontario and do all these other things that we have been talking about, including providing jobs and opportunity to the young people. And you probably read in the paper where in Quebec they're trying to reduce their deficit by $2 or $3 billion, and there's a lot of opposition, having strikes and all sorts of things happening down there. I forget what their share is, but I think it was $28 billion. It's not as big as Ontario, but it's huge, and they wouldn't have to cut back anything. On the contrary, they could do some of the things that should be done. They could limit or lower the student tuition fees that have been so much on the minds of people down there. All of this is possible, and it could be accomplished in Canada in 2 weeks with all-party agreement if the federal government ever decided that it should be done on our behalf. But if CETA is ratified, no government, no matter how enlightened and caring, could do it. Because if they did, they would be sued for hundreds of billions of dollars by European banks. And that's just how serious the situation is. I've just returned from visiting Juno Beach, Vimy, the battlefields of World War I and II, and noted again that no more than 90,000 Canadians died in the battlefields. That we could have a better life, and that we could have freedoms, and that we could have virtually unlimited opportunity. That's what they died for. That we could have a control, some kind of a control over our own lives. But we're losing our civil rights. We're losing our hope. This morning's news, the number of young people who thought of committing suicide was way up. And that's because of people losing hope after 3 or 4 or 5 years of sending out resumes and nothing coming back. So we've got to do something, and we've got to do it, in my opinion, immediately. So that's really the reason I'm here tonight, is that I've refused to sit on my buttocks and do nothing when our whole future is at stake, and we bloody well better do something about it before it's too late. So I'm enlisting your help. Join the cause, and if we get together with all of the people that I discussed earlier on, I think we can do it. The money mafia has the money, but we have the numbers. So all we have to do is get enough of us. And then the politicians will recognize the only thing that they really pay any attention to. That's the fear of losing when they run for office. So, thank you very much.
Nobody can deal with these issues without raising a lot of questions. So please line up at the mic to raise your questions, and Paul will take them.
First one's supposed to be easy, though.
It's pretty easy, I think. I've been wondering, I heard about this issue from George, and I was always wondering, is there a comparable situation in other countries to the Bank of Canada? Is this just a sort of a unique blip, or is this something that countries could ally
It's
on the basis of?
it's a complicated question, but I'll try and answer it in a minute or two.
Okay.
Canada is blessed because we own our central bank 100%. And we can do whatever we like theoretically. The United States is not so blessed because 101 years ago, just before Christmas, when the congressmen were thinking more about sugar plum fairies than they were about their business, they let a bill go through that transferred the power of the United States to create money to a group of private bankers. And the Federal Reserve System, even though it sounds as if it's a government institution and government-owned and publicly owned, is not. It's owned by the people who have been causing all the trouble from the Great Depression right on through, and there still are. So some countries own their, Britain, for example, for years, the Bank of England was privately owned. After the war, they nationalized it because it's now publicly owned. So theoretically, they have the power to do something too. The biggest problem would be the European Union. And it wasn't by accident there, but when the European Union, after it was formed, they formed a Euro bloc. And the Euro bloc turned over their rights to create their own money to the bloc. And so the European Central Bank has really the power. And it's no coincidence that the people that get those jobs used to work for Goldman Sachs or someone like that. And they could, though, however, do exactly what I'm talking about tonight and have the European Central Bank create money for each of the member states proportionate to their population. And so there are solutions, but there's some banks that are partly private, partly public, and some all public, and some all private.
Two questions. First off, what happened in 1974 that the Bank of Canada had to switch or affiliate with the Bank of International Settlements, and then how do we invoke what you're proposing? Like, what are the actual concrete steps we as citizens need to make in order to achieve your objective, which I think is brilliant?
Well, what happened in '74 was that there's no good record of what happened. But the only thing that was public was that Gerald Bowie, the governor of the bank, went to, I think it was Saskatchewan, and made a speech announcing that the bank was adopting monetarism. And that was it. I think what happened was that Canada was flattered by being offered a position on one of the important committees of the Bank for International Settlements, and that we agreed to become a member of that committee. And then you were in with the big boys, and they started giving the orders, and our Bank of Canada started following them. And there was no approval from the government. I asked Trudeau's biographer if there was anything in his papers, he has access to them all, on this subject, and he said no, none. And I got permission to look at the papers relevant to this era, and I spent about 3 days going through the papers, and there was not a single word except this idea of adopting monetarism. No explanation as to what it was going to mean and what it was going to cost Canadian people at all. Probably, partly, at least, to give them credit because they didn't understand what it really meant. What do we have to do? We have to have a government that says, we know what you want, fellow Canadians, and we're going to do it, and then to do it. It sounds easy, not so easy, right, as good as possible.
First of all, I just want to say I support everything you say, and I believe in everything you've said here. So I'm just going to play devil's advocate here for a moment. I know that if you were Prime Minister, you wouldn't have a problem with it, but do you not think that since people who have power don't like to give up power, that any prime minister who tried to do this might end up the way of the Kennedys that way, as they have to try?
I don't think so in Canada, no. We're not quite as rough as the people out there. I can tell you, well, you know, I didn't even have to be prime minister if I had been Minister of Finance. Under a prime minister that trusted me, it would have been done years ago. But there's always a but in politics. I never became Minister of Finance. And I never became prime minister. So now I have a soapbox and I'm out preaching my sermon on Sundays and holidays, and anyone that will listen to me. And we're trying to get enough power from the people to get a prime minister to listen to us.
Hi, Paul. I want to thank you actually from the center of my heart for expressing the comprehensive economic trade agreement and what it means in a really straightforward way. It is a really serious issue. It's a major game changer. It's a paradigm shift, and it's uncommonly heard in the public. And I want to say a couple things, if I can, about it, because some of us locally have been working on it intensively for 3 years, and then ask your suggestion. That's okay. So if you don't mind if I just talk for a minute.
May she have 2 or 3 minutes to speak?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So this trade deal has been really hard to get into the press. We've spoken with the Toronto Star, a courageous reporter there. She said it was very, very hard. She finally wrote a story that was a little bit hard-hitting about the municipalities. And Newswatch Canada reported it as the most underreported story in Canada in 2011. Newswatch Canada speaks out on the most dangerous stories affecting Canadians. It is very difficult because, yeah, it's talked about as trade, but this is much more than NAFTA. This is about our commons in every way. This is the financial sectors are speaking about and learning about, but as well, another story that Canadians can tell is this is about our municipalities, because on this deal is our municipal public assets. And I'm sure many people in this room know, but maybe some people don't. So in the same way that we can be sued for using our Bank of Canada in a sovereign fashion, the same with holding our local municipal assets public, because that sector is being opened. So transit, there's a number of things the provinces have opened up under the direction of the federals. So the good news is, I want to say the story that we should all jump on, I would encourage, is the city story, 40 municipalities. How many people in this room know that 40 municipalities have said no to CETA? They have not said no to a part of it, they have said we want no part. And they voted on that. And our city council, through the education of a number of some people in this room and other people, through speaking with them, our city council said no twice, once to the Ontario and once to the federal, said we don't want to be a part of it, not a part, but all of it. This is uncommon, this is historical, and there's a reason why a council would do that. There's a reason why the council that we just had, with their good qualities, but also their struggles, as we all know that are in the media, they even said no. They said it was against democracy in the first large conversation, and so much more. So I just encourage people to tell the city story, because that's a story that Canadians, it's hard to get Canadians engaged in like tougher stuff. We get scared, no, let's be polite. But they can get the city thing, that we need to hold these things public. It's a huge story, we just have to unleash it and speak it. Yeah, and I encourage you, thank you. And the other story is around the lawsuits. People also, it's fantastical, it's shocking. Let's tell that story for the long term, from now for every day, until we understand, what it means. And my question, I do have a question, is what would you encourage for just individuals to, how are we going to build this movement stronger? Because there are people working at it, Council of Canadians, different groups. How are we going to unite to speak to it and make people feel comfortable?
I don't think there's any easy way. I think we can act both individually and collectively, and should. I think we can write and I say write, not email, our members of Parliament, Prime Minister, and Minister of Finance, and Minister of Trade, and say, this is illegal, this is immoral, and we do not want you to ratify it, we want you to forget it, and start working directly for us. And if enough people did that, they would begin to listen. Well, then collectively, I think we have to be prepared. If they go ahead with attempted ratification, we have to be prepared to have 10,000 people on the Hill, and we have to be prepared maybe at that stage to get AVAS involved. But first of all, we have to have enough educated people, and I say educated in the sense of knowing what the issues are, that if that sort of a petition was launched, that it would automatically receive the kind of support that would be necessary to give it effect. So there are a lot of things that we can do, and they're going to take a lot of organization. Personally, I'm going to take Christmas and New Year's off, and then get my sword back out. So if each and every one of you would make it a cause, try and, Nelson Mandela, one of the things that helped him survive in the prison all those years was each one teach one. And he started this method of teaching the prisoners things that they didn't, they were not well-educated people, a lot of them. And so he would teach one, and then they would teach one, so each one would teach one, and it spread right through the whole prison complex. So if each one would teach one, and then we would all get ready to come together as one at some stage if necessary, I think the chances are good, and I just, it has to happen, so I hope and pray that it does.
Thank you so much. Just locally, if anybody's interested in more education, we are active. We have a very active trade justice group for the Council of Canadians. You can look up Council of Canadians London and people here from Council of Canadians. We ran many workshops on the CETA, many talks. We'd love to connect with you. Thank you.
Hey, Paul, I just want to follow up on what the gal was talking about and just maybe put two more logs in the fire you kind of put to our feet here this evening about money control. Number one, I don't know if the folks in the audience are aware of last year's federal budget. The banks have been given the right to go and grab your money if it's deemed that that bank may fail. So how many folks are aware of that? So okay. So that's fine. Okay, I don't have a lot of money in the bank, all right? But I do have RRSPs and a pension fund. How many folks have those? Okay, so here's another thing I just learned recently, Paul, is that you may think you own your RRSPs, your stocks, and your bonds. So what I want you to like to do is Google. It's a company called the Canadian Depository for Securities, okay? And basically what happens is that we may think, we would buy a stock and a bond, your name is on it. Well, actually that's not the case. There's another company's name that's on it. So you're the beneficiaries. You may reap the dividends at the end of the year, but if push comes to shove, like the government can say, take the assets out of your bank, you don't own your RRSPs, your pensions, or your stocks. That can be taken as well too. So that's something to be very scared about, okay? And what I want to ask you, Paul, is that personally, I don't trust politicians. I think they are in the pocket of that of the 1.111%. They control our politicians. So personally, I think it's useless to write letters. They say, protest all you want, folks. It ain't going to make a difference. What can we do?
I disagree. Most politicians go in with good ideas, but they get into the system. And when you have majorities in both houses, the Prime Minister is an absolute dictator of the system. And anybody that wants any kind of either favor or promotion has to walk the narrow line. The only hope is there are some people that every once in a while bolt. And all we need is probably 6 or 8 people to bolt and put their country ahead of their own interests. And that is not impossible. So let's start working on it, and let's not be pessimistic, because if we are anything but optimistic and sure we're going to win, we won't win. We write our own history, and we write it every day, and we have to pick up
Thank you.
pencil up and start going. I should say, in defense of politicians, that when somebody used to say to me, Paul, they're all crooked, and then they look at me and say, oh, except you. I say, they are in effect a cross-section of the people who elect them. And this unfortunately is true. Because you look at the papers, and the way that the corporations are, cheating in many ways, and people taking raises that they shouldn't get, or cashing checks that aren't really theirs. There's a lot of, the end of my book is a postscript saying that the missing link in all of this corruption and lying and so on is spirituality. And good things are happening. In the postscript, I have some of the good things that are happening to encourage other people. But what we need is a tsunami of changed lives dedicated to the common good rather than just personal greed and power. And it's happening with some people. It has to happen with more. And I kind of think it will. I kind of think that's the wave of the future. But we can push it along a little bit if we try.
Yeah. Paul, thank you so much for being here and for standing up. There's so many people around the world who just need to wake up to what's happening. So many Canadians, we were born and bred to be calm, cool, and collected all our lives, right? Chill out, don't talk up, don't speak up, policed by ourselves, oh, don't say that. We need to wake up. We don't need to go out and start shooting people like the Americans, but we need to wake up. Part of the waking up, and I've been seeing in some of the faces when the gentleman before me just talked about, you don't own your RSPs, you don't own your deposits, you don't. But one of the things I wanted to set in the structure, as I understand as far as the structure goes, we are the people. We own this country. We own the province. We own the government. They work for us. Then there's banks and corporations, and then they created persons. So we are also persons under the law that they create. So it's kind of a sandwich, and we're at both ends. What we need to do is step out from the one and pursue the other, because we're all sitting at the very bottom when we are actually, our birthright is at the top, under God, who is supreme. Those were the laws that this country was based upon, because those who created this believed in God, whether we do or don't. And I'm not saying either way. I'm not saying that this is a religious statement. But it's just a fact of how things were made or created by man, because it's created by men and women who believe those things. And it's okay to believe those things. But we have to act upon those things that are in our soul. It's those things that are in here that are the important things, And we can't face that. We're all in this together. The corrupt politicians, to the people beating cops, to all the good people, and they're not all bad, but we're all in this together. And we have to start looking at forgiveness. We have to look at how we can progress through this together. Because I've been working with this stuff for a couple of years. I've been taken on one of the big banks by myself. I need help, people. I've been looking for people to talk to. People want to hear, and then they want to feign interest and walk away to their sleep. I don't know how to do this. I can't do it alone. Paul can't do it alone. None of us can.
Ask George.
Let's get together.
Ask George.
Yeah, sorry.
10 more minutes questions,
Apologies.
and then
The question,
I'll sign some books.
The question then, is that true in the structure of where we're at? Are we both the people and the governed? And can we slide over?
That's a new one. Let me think about that, will you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Paul, it's kind of hard to feel hopeful when we have a government that doesn't represent most of us. So I wanted you to talk about the challenge of getting representational government here in Canada. And also, nobody's mentioned the word bail-ins, even though it was talked about. So I'm just saying that that's the term that's used for if a bank, it's now law, I believe, is that right? It's now law that if in a bank failure, that the government will allow banks to go after our money, except for the ones that come under the insured.
They convert your deposit over a certain amount into shares.
Yeah.
Which should be our choice, not theirs.
Exactly.
This is just stealing. This is.
So I just wanted you to comment about the fact that our government doesn't represent us right now, the majority of us, and it's painful to see how we can make the changes we want to.
We're going to have to. There's no chance of getting proportional representation in time to save this issue. So we better work with what we've got and go all out, work on that one further down the line, because no government in power has a real incentive to do that, because they probably got to be in power with 40% of the votes, or 35, or 42. So that's a toughie, even though in principle, 100%, but in practice, it's difficult. So let's face the reality of where we are and see if we can do something about it.
My question is more to just have some focus around the Canadian government versus the American government. And, you talked previously, most of the information you find on the web is focused around the American government and their two-party system. We here have more than that. But there's always two that's always ever been in power. If you look it up on the internet, I don't remember the last time anyone besides the Conservatives or the Liberals were in power in Canada.
Well, it's a long time.
Very long time.
Yeah.
So we kind of have a two-party system, or at least that's where all the corporate funding seems to be. And I'm sure that's where the different groups, the bankers of the Mafia of the world are probably funding mostly those two parties. So it doesn't matter which one of those two you vote for either, you probably get the same result. Is there another party system of the five, at least that we know of, that's not considered independent that we could vote for, that we would get a much better result, do you think? Just a personal question.
I'm sure there are better systems. We were just talking about one, proportional representation. But this is academic. This is the kind of thing that a lot of us talk about year after year because we believe in it in principle. But it's not going to happen in our country in time to save our country from being tied with our hands behind our back.
Okay, so it's more than just voting for one of those that are in power right now. We'd have to do something else than that.
We've got to do something.
Hi, Paul. Excellent speech. Wonderful information to help crystallize a lot of thoughts I've been thinking about too, in ways that things seem to be dysfunctional at this point in time. Primarily, I look at a couple of things like the deep web and the Bitcoin, where the multinationals will be able to go around government systems and that kind of thing, compounding the kind of situation you're talking about. And what I'm trying to find out is, how can, and like a lot of these other people in here, I think it's been wonderful you've come to talk to us and take the time out of your life, but we really need some action steps. We need to go one step at a time. We'd like to be able to coalesce some of these groups. I would like to help that as well, as I know a number of other people would on the social media perhaps. Can you give us some extra hardcore steps? Just 1, 2, 3. We'll all join you. We'll all be right behind you.
This is step one. And social media can be a step two, because there are some people recording tonight who are going to put some stuff up to the social media, and maybe somebody who sees it will get interested. And step three will be maybe in the new year trying to get various groups. The Council of Canadians have been doing great work. We've got to have them play a role in a larger coalition, I think, than just by themselves. And so we've got some work to do in coalition building, and talking tonight about a few Aboriginal connections and what we might be able to persuade them to do, because they understand the peril that's involved as well. I have to be optimistic. I believe in miracles. I wouldn't get up in the morning if I didn't. And
Thank you very much for coming out.